Before we begin, understand this is not about drugs. It's about what we do to each other in the name of control. This is not a story of raves or parties or nightclubs pulsing with electronic music until dawn. This is not about recreation or rebellion or youthful recklessness. This is a story about how a molecule created by accident in a pharmaceutical laboratory became a tool for healing, then a symbol of love, then a target of government fury. How something designed to stop bleeding became famous for opening hearts. How a substance that allowed trauma survivors to finally process their pain was declared so dangerous that possessing it could send you to prison for years. This is the story of MDMA, of ecstasy, of a drug caught forever between two worlds, the therapy room and the dance floor, scientific promise and moral panic, healing and harm. Before we go any further, I need to ask something of you. If this story interests you, if you want to see more deep dives into the hidden histories of substances that shaped our world, take a moment now, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It helps more than you know, and it reminds us both that we're not alone in seeking these buried truths. Now, phone away, distraction silenced. Let yourself settle in. What you're about to hear is complex. There will be science and death, policy and profit, good intentions corrupted and lives destroyed in the name of protection. There will be moments of genuine healing and moments of preventable tragedy. There will be a government that declared total war on a drug that made people feel universal love. And through it all, there will be a single question, hanging in the air, waiting for an answer that still hasn't come. Who decides what healing looks like? Who decides what's medicine and what's poison? Who profits from the decision? And who pays the price? So turn off your phone, settle in, and let's go back to the beginning. In 1912, in a German pharmaceutical laboratory, a chemist synthesized a molecule that would sleep for half a century before changing the world. His name was Anton Köllisch. He worked for Merck Pharmaceuticals in Darmstadt, Germany, one of the oldest and most prestigious pharmaceutical companies in the world. Founded in 1668, Merck had built its reputation on scientific rigor, chemical innovation, and the systematic development of medicines that saved lives. By the early 20th century, the company employed hundreds of chemists, all working to discover new therapeutic compounds that could be patented, manufactured, and sold to a world increasingly dependent on modern medicine. Köllisch was not trying to create a psychoactive drug. He was not researching consciousness or emotion or the human experience of euphoria. He was working on something far more mundane, hemostatic agents, drugs that could control bleeding. In an era before antibiotics, before modern surgery, before blood transfusions were routine, the ability to stop hemorrhaging was a matter of life and death. Merck was developing a class of medications called hydrostynidine derivatives, compounds designed to constrict blood vessels and prevent excessive blood loss during medical procedures or trauma. MDMA was never the goal. It was an intermediate, a stepping stone, a chemical compound synthesized a long way to something else entirely. On December 24, 1912, Christmas Eve, Merck filed German patent 274350. The patent described a series of chemical compounds, including one with the formal name 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. The name itself is a description of the molecule's structure, a methamphetamine backbone, a stimulant core, with a methylene dioxy ring attached. This ring, 2 oxygen atoms bridging 2 carbon atoms on the benzene structure, would turn out to be critical. It was this small modification, this subtle rearrangement of atoms that gave MDMA properties unlike any other stimulant known to science. But in 1912, no one knew that. No one tested it. No one administered it to animals or humans to see what it might do. Merck's chemists were looking for blood clotting agents, and MDMA did not fit the profile. It was cataloged, patented to protect Merck's intellectual property, and shelved. The molecule was filed away in patent archives, a footnote in the company's research logs, forgotten almost as soon as it was created. This was the pharmaceutical golden age in Germany, before World War I would shatter Europe, before the Treaty of Versailles would devastate the German economy, before the rise of fascism would drive Jewish scientists into exile and turn German industry toward war. This was a time of optimism and innovation. German pharmaceutical companies led the world. They had discovered aspirin, synthesized heroin as a cough suppressant, developed barbiturates as sedatives.
Chemistry was seen as a force for human progress, a way to
master nature and alleviate suffering. And in the middle of all this progress, a molecule was born that no one wanted, no one understood, no one even noticed. The irony is almost unbearable. MDMA, a drug that would one day be taken by millions, that would inspire religious devotion and government fury in equal measure, that would be called both a miracle therapy and a deadly poison, was created by accident and immediately dismissed as useless. For 41 years, it sat in archives, a patent number, a chemical formula on paper, nothing more. The chemists who synthesized it had no idea they had created something that would one day allow trauma survivors to speak about their pain without reliving it. They had no idea they had stumbled onto a molecule that could flood the human brain with serotonin and produce feelings of overwhelming empathy and connection. They had no idea that this forgotten compound would one day be banned in nearly every country on Earth, classified alongside heroin and cocaine as having no legitimate medical use. They were looking for something to stop bleeding. They found something that would open hearts, and then they ignored it. The molecule slept, but in 1953, the United States military decided to wake it up. The Korean War had ended in an uneasy armistice. American soldiers had returned home with stories that terrified military intelligence officials, stories of prisoners of war who had confessed to crimes they did not commit, who had denounced their own country, who had emerged from captivity speaking in propaganda slogans as if their minds had been erased and rewritten. The term used was brainwashing, a translation of the Chinese phrase "xi nao," and it suggested something profoundly disturbing, that the human mind could be controlled, manipulated, reprogrammed through psychological and chemical means. If the communists had developed such techniques, the logic went, then America needed to develop them too, or develop defenses against them, or both. This was the Cold War at its most paranoid, a global struggle fought not just with missiles and armies, but with espionage, propaganda, and the darkest corners of human psychology. And so the United States government, through agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, launched a series of classified research programs designed to explore the outer limits of what chemistry could do to the human mind. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a sprawling military testing facility that had been used during World War I to develop chemical weapons like mustard gas and phosgene, Army researchers began testing thousands of compounds. They were looking for truth serums, drugs that would make enemy prisoners incapable of lying during interrogation. They were looking for incapacitating agents, chemicals that could disable soldiers without killing them, rendering entire battalions helpless and confused. They were looking for anything that might give the United States an edge in the invisible war being waged in laboratories and interrogation rooms. Between 1953 and 1954, MDMA entered this classified world. Someone somewhere in the Army Chemical Corps had noticed Merck's old patent. Perhaps they were systematically testing every amphetamine derivative they could find. Perhaps they were exploring methylene dioxy compounds. The exact reasons remain unclear, buried in files that were classified for decades. What is known is that MDMA was subjected to a battery of tests: animal studies, toxicity trials, LD50 tests, experiments designed to determine the lethal dose that would kill 50
vulnerable populations, prisoners, psychiatric patients, sex workers, as test subjects. The goal was to explore mind control, to see if drugs could be used to break down personality, to create programmable human beings. MDMA was tested during this era, though it never became a focus of MKUltra the way LSD did. The Army Chemical Corps tested it on animals. The CIA may have tested it on humans, though the records are fragmentary, many having been deliberately destroyed in 1973 when the program was exposed and shut down. What is certain is that MDMA was examined, evaluated, and ultimately dismissed. It did not produce the dramatic effects that LSD did. It did not fit the profile of a useful interrogation tool. It was not what they were looking for. And so, once again, the molecule was forgotten. The classified files were locked away in government archives. The researchers moved on to other projects. The Cold War raged on, fought with weapons both conventional and chemical, while MDMA returned to obscurity, a footnote in a classified report, a drug that had been tested twice and dismissed twice, waiting in the dark for someone to finally understand what it could do. For 2 more decades, MDMA remained unknown to the world. Then, in 1965, a Berkeley chemist named Alexander Shulgin changed everything. Alexander Theodore Shulgin, Sasha to everyone who knew him, was not a typical scientist. He held a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. He had worked for Dow Chemical in the 1960s, where he developed the first biodegradable pesticide and earned the company millions. But Shulgin was not interested in profit or corporate success. He was interested in consciousness, in the vast, unmapped territory of the human mind and the chemical compounds that could alter it. In 1966, Dow granted Shulgin an unusual privilege, his own private laboratory, where he could pursue whatever research interested him. He used that freedom to begin synthesizing and testing psychedelic compounds, mescaline, psilocybin analogs, amphetamine derivatives. He was methodical, disciplined, scientific. He kept detailed notes. He always tested compounds on himself first, carefully documenting dose, effects, duration, subjective experience. This was not recklessness. This was pharmacological exploration conducted with the rigor of a trained chemist and the curiosity of a philosopher. In 1965, Shulgin synthesized MDMA. He found the old Merck patent, studied the chemical structure, and recreated the molecule in his laboratory. But he did not try it, not yet. He was synthesizing dozens of compounds during this period, and MDMA was just one entry in his notebooks filed away for future exploration. 11 years passed. In September of 1976, at the age of 51, Alexander Shulgin finally ingested MDMA for the first time. The dose was 120 milligrams. He was at home in his laboratory on his property in Lafayette, California, with his wife Anne beside him. What he experienced changed his life. He described it later as a window opening. Not the visual distortions of LSD or the profound disorientation of high-dose mescaline. This was something else entirely. A gentle, warm sense of emotional clarity. He could think clearly. He could speak freely. He felt an overwhelming sense of empathy, not just for Anne, but for all human beings, for the struggles and pain and beauty of existence. Difficult topics that might normally be approached with defensiveness or fear became easy to discuss. There was no anxiety, no guardedness, just openness, connection, understanding. Shulgin recognized immediately that this was not a recreational drug. This was a tool, a therapeutic tool, something that could help people access their own emotions, confront their own trauma, communicate with each other in ways that were normally blocked by fear and conditioning. He began sharing MDMA with friends in the psychiatric and psychotherapy community, and one of those friends was a man named Leo Zeff. Leo Zeff was born in 1912. By the 1970s, he was a semi-retired psychotherapist who had spent decades treating patients using traditional talk therapy. He had experimented with LSD-assisted therapy in the 1960s before the government banned it. He was open-minded, experienced, and deeply committed to finding tools that could help people heal. In 1977, Zeff tried MDMA for the first time. He was 65 years old. The experience moved him so profoundly that he came out of retirement. He devoted the rest of his career, another 17 years, to introduce MDMA to the therapeutic community and training other therapists in how to use it responsibly. He traveled across the United States and to Europe, conducting workshops, sharing his protocols, teaching therapists how to create safe settings, how to guide patients through the MDMA experience, how to integrate the insights afterward. Zeff called the drug Adam, a return to a state of innocence, the Edenic state before shame.
Before fear, before the walls we build around our hearts to protect ourselves from pain. Between 1977 and 1985, an underground network of therapists began using MDMA in their practices, carefully, responsibly. They administered controlled doses, typically between 75 and 125 milligrams, in therapeutic settings with trained supervision. They treated patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, veterans haunted by combat memories, survivors of sexual assault who could not speak about what had happened to them. They used it in couples therapy, helping partners communicate openly about resentments and fears that had calcified over years of marriage. They used it with terminally ill patients facing death, helping them process their fear and find peace. The results were remarkable. Patients who had been in therapy for years without progress experienced breakthroughs in a single MDMA session. Trauma that had been locked away, too painful to access, could be examined and processed without the overwhelming fear that usually accompanied it. Couples on the brink of divorce reconnected, remembered why they had loved each other, found ways to forgive. By the mid-1980s, an estimated 4,000 therapists were using MDMA in their practices. This was not advertised. It was not public. It was a quiet, underground movement of professionals who believed they had found something valuable and were using it carefully, ethically, in service of healing.
Some published papers in academic journals, low-profile publications that most people never read. The research was preliminary, uncontrolled, not the double-blind clinical trials that the FDA would require for approval, but it was promising. It suggested that MDMA had a unique ability to facilitate psychotherapy, to create a state of mind where patients could confront their pain without being overwhelmed by it. This was MDMA's golden age, a brief window, less than a decade, when the drug existed in a space between discovery and prohibition, when it was used for healing, not for recreation, when the people who knew about it treated it with respect, with care, with the seriousness it deserved. It could not last. But in the early 1980s, something changed. The secret leaked out of the therapy room and onto the streets of Texas. It began quietly, almost innocuously. A few therapists in California shared MDMA with friends outside the clinical setting. Those friends told other friends. Word spread through social networks, through college campuses, through the underground circles where people were always looking for new experiences, new ways to feel connected, new alternatives to alcohol and cocaine. And then someone realized something that would change everything. MDMA was legal. Completely, unambiguously legal. It had never been scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act. It was not on any DEA watch list. It was not illegal to manufacture, not illegal to sell, not illegal to possess. As long as it was not marketed as a pharmaceutical drug requiring FDA approval, it existed in a legal gray area that a few enterprising individuals recognized as a spectacular business opportunity. In 1981, in Dallas and Austin, Texas, the commercialization began. The key figures were drug entrepreneurs, not street dealers, but businessmen who saw MDMA as a product to be marketed, branded, and distributed through legitimate-looking channels. One of the most prominent was a man named Michael Clegg, a distributor who helped establish networks across Texas. Another was a loose confederation of chemists and distributors known as the Boston Group, who set up small-scale manufacturing operations and began producing MDMA in quantities measured not in grams, but in kilograms. They gave the drug a name designed for mass appeal, Ecstasy. Not MDMA, not methylene dioxymethamphetamine, not Atom, the name the therapists used. Ecstasy, a promise in a single word. Bliss, transcendence, euphoria. It was marketing genius. The name sold itself. And sell it did, openly, brazenly. MDMA was distributed through bars and nightclubs in Dallas and Austin. Sellers walked through crowds offering pills like they were selling concert merchandise. Some clubs had MDMA dealers working the floor, approaching patients directly, handing out business cards. The drug was advertised in local magazines, in classifieds, in flyers posted on telephone poles. Ecstasy, the legal alternative to cocaine. Feel the love, guaranteed pure. The distribution model was pyramid style. Sellers recruited subsellers who recruited their own networks. Each level took a cut. It was multi-level marketing applied to psychoactive drugs, and it worked extraordinarily well. By 1984, estimates suggest that 30,000 doses per month were being sold in Texas alone. 30,000 pills every month in a drug that most Americans had never even heard of. The price point was deliberately high, $20 to $30 per dose. This was not a cheap street drug.
This was positioned as an upscale experience, a sophisticated alternative to the cocaine that was flooding through American cities in the early 1980s. The target market was young professionals, college students, the upwardly mobile crowd that frequented nightclubs in Dallas's trendy neighborhoods. Lawyers, stockbrokers, real estate agents, graduate students, people with disposable income and a taste for chemically enhanced socializing. The scene that developed around ecstasy in Texas was unlike anything associated with previous drug cultures. This was not the counterculture of the 1960s, not the gritty urban decay of heroin, not the paranoia and violence of crack cocaine. This was clean, safe, almost wholesome by comparison. Users described profound conversations, deep connections with strangers, a sense of empathy and openness that made social barriers dissolve. People hugged, they talked for hours. They felt, for a few hours at least, like they understood each other in ways that were normally impossible. From Texas, ecstasy spread rapidly. Miami became a major distribution hub, the drug flowing through the same networks that moved cocaine from South America. Los Angeles, with its sprawling nightclub scene, embraced MDMA enthusiastically. New York, San Francisco. By the mid-1980s, ecstasy was available in every major American city, sold not in back alleys, but in clubs, at parties,
through networks of college students and young professionals who saw it as a safe, legal, almost respectable way to enhance their social lives. The media began to notice. Local news stations ran segments on the new legal high sweeping Texas. Magazines published articles with titles like Ecstasy, the love drug, and MDMA, a safe alternative. The coverage was mostly neutral, sometimes even positive, treating ecstasy as a cultural curiosity rather than a threat. After all, it was legal. Users were not dying. There was no wave of overdoses, no crime epidemic, no obvious social harm. But the Drug Enforcement Administration was paying attention. And so was the therapeutic community that had nurtured MDMA in quiet, careful obscurity for nearly a decade. The therapists who had used the drug to help trauma survivors, to save marriages, to ease the fear of dying patients, they watched in horror as their sacred medicine was rebranded, commodified, and sold as a party drug to crowds of people who had no idea what they were taking or why it mattered. Leo Zeff, the psychotherapist who had devoted his retirement to sharing MDMA responsibly, was devastated. Alexander Shulgin, the chemist who had rediscovered the molecule and recognized its therapeutic potential, felt a deep sense of loss. They had known this might happen, they had feared it, but they had hoped, perhaps naively, that MDMA could remain in the therapeutic underground long enough to be studied properly, to be understood, to eventually gain FDA approval as a legitimate medicine. That hope was dying. The commercialization of ecstasy made prohibition inevitable. The DEA could not ignore a drug being sold openly in nightclubs, advertised in magazines, spreading across the country with no regulatory oversight. The therapeutic potential, the careful research, the years of responsible use in clinical settings, none of that would matter. The drug had escaped, it had become a commodity, and commodities, especially psychoactive commodities, attract the attention of law enforcement. Congressional hearings were scheduled. DEA chemists began analyzing seized samples. Media coverage shifted from curiosity to concern. The machinery of prohibition, slow at first, began to accelerate. The therapeutic community prepared for the worst. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before with LSD, with psilocybin, with every promising psychedelic compound that had shown therapeutic potential and then been criminalized because of recreational use. The pattern was depressingly familiar. By 1985, the party was over. The Drug Enforcement Administration had seen enough, and they were coming for ecstasy. On May 31, 1985, the DEA broke its emergency scheduling powers, a legal authority granted under the Controlled Substances Act that allowed the agency to temporarily ban a drug while it conducted a full review to determine permanent classification. MDMA was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for substances deemed to have high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety even under medical supervision. Heroin was Schedule 1, LSD was Schedule 1, and now overnight MDMA was 2. The emergency ban lasted 1 year. During that time, the DEA would hold hearings, gather evidence, and make a final determination about where MDMA should be permanently classified. But the temporary ban had immediate consequences. Manufacturing became illegal, distribution became illegal, possession became illegal. Anyone caught with MDMA now faced federal
prosecution. The therapeutic community, blindsided by the speed and severity of the action, mobilized immediately. They filed a lawsuit. Earth Metabolic Design Laboratories, EMDL, a small organization that had been legally distributing MDMA for research purposes, sued the DEA, arguing that the agency had acted without proper scientific review, without considering the drug's therapeutic value, without giving the medical community a fair hearing. The court agreed to administrative hearings. For over a year, from the summer of 1985 through the summer of 1986, an administrative law judge named Francis Young presided over testimony from therapists, researchers, patients, and DEA officials. It was a trial in everything but name. The future of MDMA hung in the balance. The therapists came prepared. Dr. George Greer, a psychiatrist from New Mexico who had conducted some of the earliest systematic research on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, testified about his work with patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He described veterans who had not spoken about their combat experiences in decades finally able to process their trauma. He presented data showing that MDMA sessions allowed patients to confront painful memories without being overwhelmed by fear, that the drug created a therapeutic window where healing could occur. Dr. Joseph Downing, a physician from California, testified about using MDMA in couples therapy. He described marriages on the brink of collapse, partners who had not communicated honestly in years, suddenly able to speak openly about their fears, their resentments, their lingering love. He spoke of reconciliations, of relationships saved, of families kept intact. Other therapists testified about terminally ill patients, cancer patients facing death who were consumed by fear and existential despair.
MDMA, they said, allowed these patients to confront their mortality with peace, to say goodbye to loved ones with clarity and grace, to die without terror. Dozens of therapists came forward. They presented case studies, clinical notes, patient testimonials. They emphasized that MDMA was not being used recklessly, not being handed out in nightclubs, not being promoted as a recreational drug. In the therapeutic context, under professional supervision, with careful dose control and integration therapy, MDMA had proven itself remarkably effective and remarkably safe. There were no reports of addiction, no overdoses, no long-term harm in the patient populations they had treated. They argued that MDMA should be classified as Schedule III, a category for drugs with recognized medical uses that could be prescribed by physicians under regulatory oversight. Schedule III would allow research to continue, would permit doctors to use MDMA in clinical settings, would acknowledge the drug's therapeutic potential while still maintaining controls to prevent abuse. The DEA presented a different case. Their witnesses focused on animal studies showing neurotoxicity, damage to serotonin-producing neurons in the brains of rats and monkeys given high doses of MDMA over extended periods. They argued that any drug capable of causing brain damage, even in animal models, was too dangerous to be used in humans. They cited the rapid spread of recreational ecstasy use, the thousands of doses being sold in nightclubs, the potential for abuse by people who were not under medical supervision. The DEA's position was clear. MDMA was dangerous, it was being abused, and it needed to be criminalized. The therapeutic use, however promising it might appear, was irrelevant. The agency's mandate was to protect public health by removing dangerous substances from circulation, and MDMA fit that profile. In September of 1986, Judge Francis Young issued his recommendation. After reviewing all the evidence, after hearing testimony from both sides, after considering the scientific literature and the clinical experiences presented by the therapists, he concluded that MDMA should be placed in Schedule III. His ruling was detailed, carefully reasoned, and unambiguous. MDMA, he wrote, had accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. The evidence demonstrated that it was being used by qualified professionals in therapeutic settings with beneficial outcomes. The abuse potential, while present, was low compared to other controlled substances. The neurotoxicity concerns, while worthy of further research, were based on animal studies using doses far higher than those used in human therapy. Schedule III, Judge Young concluded, was the appropriate classification, strict enough to prevent widespread abuse, flexible enough to allow continued medical research and use. It was a victory for the therapeutic community. A federal judge, after extensive hearings, had ruled in their favor. The evidence had been heard, the science had been considered. Justice, it seemed, had prevailed. And then the DEA rejected the ruling. In an unprecedented move, DEA
Administrator John Lawn announced that the agency would not accept Judge Young's recommendation. Despite the administrative law judge's conclusion, despite the testimony of therapists and researchers, despite the documented therapeutic uses, the DEA decided to place MDMA in Schedule I anyway. On March 23, 1988, the classification became permanent. MDMA was declared to have no medical use, high abuse potential, and insufficient safety for use even under medical supervision. It was illegal to manufacture, illegal to distribute, illegal to possess. Conducting research required a special DEA license that was nearly impossible to obtain. The bureaucratic requirements were designed to be insurmountable: extensive background checks, secure storage facilities, detailed protocols approved by multiple federal agencies, ongoing inspections. This was the first time in the history of the Controlled Substances Act that the DEA had overruled an administrative law judge's recommendation on drug scheduling. The precedent was chilling. It signaled that scientific evidence, clinical testimony, and legal rulings were all subordinate to the agency's own agenda. The DEA had the power to criminalize substances regardless of what judges, doctors, or researchers concluded. For the therapists who had testified, who had exposed their practices to federal scrutiny in the hope that truth and evidence would matter, the result was devastating. Overnight, their work became illegal. Continuing to use MDMA in therapy meant risking federal prosecution, prison, the loss of their medical licenses, the destruction of their careers. Some stopped immediately. Others went deeper underground, continuing to practice in secret, knowing they were now criminals. Alexander Shulgin, watching from California, understood what had been lost. The molecule he had rediscovered, the tool he had recognized as having profound therapeutic potential, had been criminalized not because science had proven it dangerous, but because politics had declared it unacceptable. The therapists went underground or stopped using MDMA entirely, but on the other side of the Atlantic, a different story was beginning. In 1987, a small group of British DJs traveled to Ibiza, a Mediterranean island off the coast of Spain that had become Europe's party capital. They went to the legendary nightclubs Amnesia, Pacha, Coup, massive open-air venues where thousands danced until dawn under the stars.
The music was unlike anything they had heard before: electronic, hypnotic, driving rhythms built on synthesizers and drum machines, layered with samples and bass lines that seemed designed to match the rhythm of the human heart. And everyone was on ecstasy. The DJs, Paul Oakenfold, Danny Rampling, Nikki Holloway, Johnny Walker, experienced something they had never felt before. The combination of MDMA and electronic music created a state of collective euphoria unlike anything in their experience. Strangers became friends, barriers dissolved. For hours they danced, lost in the music, connected to everyone around them in a way that felt almost spiritual. They brought ecstasy back to the UK, and they brought the music with them. Acid house, a genre that had emerged from Chicago in the mid-1980s, characterized by the squelching, hypnotic sound of the Roland TB-303 bass synthesizer. Techno from Detroit, harder-edged, futuristic, relentless. These sounds, combined with MDMA, would ignite a cultural revolution. In 1988, the second summer of love began. Underground warehouse parties exploded across Britain. Abandoned factories, empty aircraft hangars, fields outside London, anywhere a sound system could be set up, thousands of young people appeared. The locations were secret, spread by word of mouth, by flyers handed out in record shops, by whispered rumors. No official venues, no permits, no control, just music, lights, and ecstasy. Clubs like Shoom in London, founded by Danny Rampling, became legendary. Spectrum and Future followed. But the epicenter, the cathedral of rave culture, was the Hacienda in Manchester. Owned by Factory Records and members of the band New Order, the Hacienda transformed from a struggling nightclub into the most famous dance venue in the world. On any given weekend night, thousands pocked the floors, dancing to acid house and techno, swept up in a movement that felt like more than entertainment. It felt like social transformation. Ecstasy made the experience possible. The drug allowed people to dance for 8, 10, 12 hours without exhaustion. It dissolved the usual social hierarchies, class barriers that defined British society. Working class, middle class, posh university students, council estate kids, all of it evaporated on the dance floor. Black and white, straight and gay, everyone was equal in the rave. There was no aggression, no violence, no sexual predation, just dancing, connection, unity. People who were there describe it in almost religious terms. Everyone was your
best friend. Strangers hugged, exchanged numbers, made plans to meet at the next rave. The smiley face, a simple yellow circle with 2 dots and a curve, became the symbol of the movement, printed on t-shirts, painted on walls, held up as a totem of positivity and love. Fashion shifted: baggy jeans, oversized t-shirts, comfortable shoes for dancing. Pacifiers appeared. Users sucked on them to prevent the jaw clenching that MDMA caused, a physical side effect turned into fashion statement. This was not hedonism, or rather, it was not just hedonism. The people who lived through the second summer of love insist on this distinction. It was communal, transcendent, a temporary utopia where the usual rules of British society did not apply. No violence, just love. No judgment, just acceptance. It could not last. The British tabloid press, never shy about manufacturing moral panic, discovered raves in late 1988. The headlines were lurid, hysterical, designed to terrify parents and enrage politicians. Acid house horror, evil of ecstasy, drug-crazed ravers in countryside chaos. The coverage portrayed ravers as degenerate, drug-addled threats to public order. Photographs of young people with dilated pupils, mouths open mid-dance, were printed alongside warnings about brain damage, addiction, death. The government responded with force. Police raid raves, arresting organizers, confiscating sound equipment. Clubs were shut down. The Hacienda faced constant police surveillance. Rave organizers were prosecuted under obscure public order laws. In 1990, Parliament passed the Entertainment's Increased Penalties Act, imposing massive fines, up to £20,000 and 6 months in prison, for anyone organizing unlicensed music events. It was targeted explicitly at raves, at the warehouse parties that had defined the second summer of love. But the culture did not die. It went further underground. Raves moved to more remote locations: forests, beaches, abandoned military bases. The gatherings grew larger. By the early 1990s, raves with 20,000 attendees were not uncommon. The music evolved: harder, faster, more aggressive. Genres splintered: jungle, drum and bass, hardcore, gobber. And MDMA remained at the center of it all.
In 1994, the government passed the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that included a provision specifically targeting raves. The law banned unauthorized gatherings of more than 20 people at which music includes sounds wholly or predominantly characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. The government had literally outlawed repetitive beats. It was absurd. It was draconian. It was a declaration of war on an entire youth culture. Rave culture was pushed further underground, but it did not disappear. And MDMA, banned, demonized, the subject of endless tabloid hysteria, continued to spread across Europe. Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, Barcelona, every major city developed its own rave scene, its own clubs, its own underground parties. MDMA use exploded. The second summer of love was over, but the drug had escaped into the world. But as ecstasy spread across the world, people began to die. Not in large numbers, not in the cataclysmic waves that characterized heroin overdoses or alcohol poisoning, but enough to make headlines, enough to terrify parents, enough to become the public face of MDMA, replacing the stories of therapeutic breakthroughs and communal transcendence with images of grieving families and young lives cut short. The most famous case, the one that would define public perception of ecstasy for a generation, was Leah Betts. Leah Sarah Betts was 18 years old. She lived in Latchington, Essex, in the United Kingdom, with her parents, Paul and Janet. She was by all accounts a normal teenager, bright, social, loved by her friends, studying for her A-levels with plans to attend university. November 13th, 1995 was her 18th birthday. She celebrated at home with a small group of close friends. No club night, no rave, just a quiet party in a safe, familiar environment. Someone gave her an ecstasy tablet. She took it. Leah had been taught, like most British teenagers in the mid-1990s, that ecstasy caused dangerous overheating and dehydration. Anti-drug education campaigns emphasized this repeatedly. If you take ecstasy, you must drink water to avoid heat stroke. It was the central message of every public health warning, every school assembly, every parent-child conversation about the dangers of raves and drugs. Leah followed that advice, carefully, conscientiously. In the 90 minutes after taking the pill, she drank approximately 7 liters of water. 7 liters, nearly 2 gallons. An amount of water that under normal circumstances the human body would struggle to process. But MDMA does something unusual to the body's regulation of fluids. It causes the brain to release a hormone called vasopressin, which tells the kidneys to retain
Water, rather than expel it through urine, the body holds on to the water. And if you keep drinking, if you consume liters and liters because you have been told that dehydration is the danger, the water has nowhere to go. It floods the bloodstream. It dilutes the sodium in your blood to dangerously low levels, a condition called hyponatremia. And when the blood becomes too diluted, water moves into cells, trying to balance the concentration. Brain cells swell. The brain, trapped inside the rigid skull, has no room to expand. Pressure builds. Damage occurs. Leah collapsed. She was rushed to Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford. Doctors placed her on life support, but the brain damage was catastrophic, irreversible. On November 16, 1995, 3 days after her birthday, her parents made the decision to withdraw life support. Leah Betts died. Her parents, shattered but determined, made a choice. They would use their daughter's death to warn other young people about the dangers of ecstasy. They released a photograph, Leah in the hospital, tubes and wires connected to her body, unconscious, dying. It became one of the most widely distributed anti-drug images in history. Billboards across the UK displayed the photo with the caption, "Sorted, just one ecstasy tablet took Leah Betts." The campaign was well-intentioned. Paul and Janet Betts believed, as many parents would, that if young people saw the reality of what ecstasy could do, they would be frightened enough to refuse it. The image was visceral, undeniable, heartbreaking. But the message was wrong. Leah Betts did not die from ecstasy toxicity. She died from water intoxication. She died because she had been taught that dehydration was the primary danger, and she followed that advice to a fatal extreme. The anti-drug education that was supposed to protect her had given her incomplete, misleading information that directly contributed to her death. The medical reality of MDMA deaths is complex, and that complexity is rarely communicated in public health campaigns. People die from hyperthermia, overheating, usually in hot, crowded environments where they dance for hours without rest or cooling breaks. They die from hyponatremia,
water intoxication, like Leah. They die from underlying heart conditions that MDMA stimulant effects exacerbate. They die from adulterated pills that contain not MDMA, but other, more dangerous substances. They die from combinations, MDMA mixed with alcohol, with other stimulants, with medications that interact badly. Most of these deaths are preventable. With proper education, drink water moderately, take breaks to cool down, test your pills to know what you are actually taking, do not mix substances, know your health history. The risk drops dramatically. Harm reduction, the approach used successfully in countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland, acknowledges that people will use drugs and focuses on minimizing harm rather than demanding abstinence. But in the UK, in the United States, and Australia, harm reduction was seen as enabling drug use. Providing pill testing services at raves, that sends the message that drug use is acceptable. Teaching people how to use MDMA more safely, that encourages experimentation. The policy response to deaths like Leah Betz's was not evidence-based harm reduction. It was moral panic and increased punishment. Leah was not the only one. In Australia, Anna Wood, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, died in October 1995 after taking ecstasy at a rave. Like Leah, she drank excessive water and died from hyponatremia. Her death sparked a media frenzy in Australia, with tabloids calling for harsher penalties and nightclub crackdowns. Felicia Byrne, also from Australia, died in 1995 under similar circumstances. Each death was a tragedy, each death was preventable, and each death became a tool for prohibition advocates to argue for zero tolerance, for shutting down raves, for arresting more people. The statistics, when examined honestly, told a more complicated story. Research suggested that approximately 1 MDMA user in 10,000 died from acute complications related to the drug. 1 in 10,000. For context, alcohol kills approximately 1 in 6,000 regular drinkers annually. Tobacco kills 1 in 5 long-term smokers. Horse riding, skiing, and dozens of other recreational activities have higher fatality rates than MDMA use. But MDMA deaths were young people, teenagers, university students. Their deaths were sudden, unexpected, often their first time using the drug. And so each one became a headline, a cautionary tale, a reason to reject harm reduction and double down on prohibition. Governments responded predictably. Increased penalties for possession and distribution, more police at nightclub entrances, shutdowns of venues associated with rave culture, zero tolerance policies. But they did not fund pill testing. They did not teach accurate information about how to minimize risk. They did not acknowledge
that prohibition itself, by ensuring an unregulated market where pills contained unknown substances, was a primary driver of the deaths they claimed to be preventing. The deaths of Leah Betz, Anna Wood, Felicia Byrne, and hundreds of others were real tragedies. They deserved better than to be used as propaganda. They deserved policies based on evidence, on harm reduction, on the recognition that young people will make their own choices, and that the role of public health is to ensure those choices are as informed and as safe as possible. Instead, their deaths became justification for the same failed policies that had created the conditions for their deaths in the first place. As the deaths mounted, scientists began asking a critical question. What is ecstasy actually doing to the brain? The pharmacology of MDMA is well understood. When ingested, the drug crosses the blood-brain barrier and floods the brain with serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood regulation, along with smaller releases of dopamine and norepinephrine. This neurochemical cascade produces the characteristic effects: euphoria, profound empathy, emotional openness, increased energy. Users report feeling deeply connected to others, able to speak about difficult topics without fear or defensiveness, wrapped in a warm sense of well-being that lasts for several hours. But there are side effects: jaw clenching and teeth grinding caused by muscle tension, increased heart rate and blood pressure, typical of stimulants, dehydration risk, exacerbated by dancing in hot environments. And then the question that dominated research for decades: was MDMA neurotoxic? Did it cause permanent damage to the brain? The first animal studies, conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, suggested yes. Researchers administered high doses of MDMA to rats and monkeys and found evidence of damage to serotonergic neurons, the brain cells that produce and release serotonin. The damage appeared in specific brain regions, particularly the cortex and hippocampus, and persisted for weeks or months after the drug was discontinued. The studies were concerning. If MDMA was killing serotonin neurons in animals, what was it doing to humans? Dr. George Ricaute, a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins University, became the leading figure in MDMA neurotoxicity research.
His work was funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, the federal agency responsible for studying the health effects of controlled substances. Ricaurte's studies reinforced the narrative that MDMA was dangerous, that recreational use carried serious long-term risks, that the therapeutic potential, whatever it might be, was outweighed by the threat of brain damage. Then, in 2002, Ricaurte published a bombshell study in Science, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. The study claimed that MDMA caused severe dopamine neurotoxicity, not just serotonin damage, but destruction of dopamine neurons, the same kind of damage seen in Parkinson's disease. The implications were terrifying. If true, it meant that even moderate MDMA use could lead to irreversible motor dysfunction, tremors, the progressive neurological decline that characterizes Parkinsonism. The Drug Enforcement Administration seized on the study immediately. The DEA and NIDA cited Ricaurte's findings to justify continued Schedule I classification, to oppose research applications for MDMA-assisted therapy, to argue that the drug was simply too dangerous to be used under any circumstances. The study became a weapon in the drug war. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. In 2003, Ricaurte retracted the study. The laboratory had made a mistake. The vials used in the experiment, which were supposed to contain MDMA, had actually contained methamphetamine, a structurally similar but far more neurotoxic drug. The entire study, the data showing devastating dopamine damage, the conclusions about Parkinson's risk, all of it was based on the wrong substance. The retraction was a scandal. How had peer review at Science failed to catch this? How had Ricaurte's lab, experienced and well-funded, confused two different drugs? How had the DEA and NIDA promoted the findings so aggressively without independent verification? The damage to the credibility of anti-MDMA research was profound. If the most prominent neurotoxicity researcher in the field could publish fundamentally flawed data in the world's top journal, what did that say about the rest of the evidence? How much of the neurotoxicity narrative was based on solid science, and how much was driven by the need to justify prohibition? Subsequent studies painted a more nuanced picture. Yes, chronic heavy use of MDMA, particularly at high doses in hot environments, combined with other substances, appeared to cause changes in the serotonin system. Some long-term users reported persistent mood issues, memory problems, difficulty regulating emotions. But the data was messy.
Studies relied on self-reported drug use, and people who used MDMA heavily often used other drugs too: alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, amphetamines. Separating the effects of MDMA from polydrug use was nearly impossible. Moderate use, in the doses recommended for therapeutic contexts, appeared relatively safe, certainly safer than alcohol, which is neurotoxic at any level of chronic use, safer than tobacco, which kills tens of thousands annually. But nuance does not make for effective drug war messaging. The conversation remained polarized. MDMA is either a miracle or a poison, with little space for the complicated middle ground where most truths reside. The fundamental problem was research access. MDMA's Schedule I classification made conducting rigorous human studies extraordinarily difficult. Researchers needed special DEA licenses, secure storage facilities, approval from multiple institutional review boards, and funding from agencies that were often ideologically opposed to finding positive results. It was a catch-22. MDMA was classified as too dangerous to study because it was dangerous, but the evidence of danger was weak precisely because it could not be studied properly. Science was caught in the crossfire of the drug war, and the truth, whatever it was, remained obscured by politics, by flawed studies, by the need for both sides to present certainty where none existed. While scientists debated neurotoxicity, a different kind of poison was flooding the market. Prohibition had accomplished exactly what it always accomplishes. It drove production and distribution underground, where there is no regulation, no quality control, no accountability. By the late 1990s, the black market for ecstasy had exploded globally, and with it came a grim reality that users could not escape. The pills they were buying, the tablets stamped with friendly logos and sold with confident assurances, often contained little or no MDMA at all. Common adulterants included methamphetamine, which was cheaper to produce and gave users energy, but lacked MDMA's empathogenic effects. MDA, a related compound that was more hallucinogenic and more toxic. Methylone, a synthetic cathinone that mimicked some of MDMA's effects, but with higher risks. Caffeine and ephedrine, stimulants that provide a buzz, but nothing resembling the MDMA experience. And sometimes, nothing at all. Just inert powders pressed into pill form and sold to people who had no way to verify what they were ingesting. But the most dangerous adulterant, the one that killed with frightening efficiency, was PMA, paramethoxyamphetamine. PMMA, its close relative, was equally deadly.
Both were amphetamine derivatives that had been synthesized decades earlier and abandoned because they were far too toxic for any legitimate use. But in the world of illicit drug manufacturing, where profit margins matter more than safety, PMA became a common substitute for MDMA. It was cheaper, it was easier to synthesize from available precursor chemicals, and to someone without a chemistry lab, a PMA pill looked identical to an MDMA pill. The pharmacology of PMA is what makes it so lethal. Unlike MDMA, which takes effect within 30 to 60 minutes, PMA has a slower onset, sometimes taking 90 minutes or more before users feel anything. This delay is catastrophic because users, thinking the pill is weak or fake, take a second dose or a third. By the time the first dose kicks in, they have already consumed a potentially lethal amount. And when PMA does take effect, it causes severe hyperthermia, body temperature rising to dangerous, often fatal levels. The lethal dose is much lower than MDMA's. There is little margin for error. Between 1995 and 2005, waves of PMA deaths swept across the world. In December 2000, 6 people died in Canada within a matter of days, all from pills sold as Ecstasy that contained PMA instead. In 2002, a cluster of deaths in Orlando, Florida were traced back to PMA-laced tablets. Australia, which had one of the highest rates of MDMA use per capita in the world, saw dozens of PMA deaths during this period. Europe experienced similar tragedies. The UK, Germany, the Netherlands all reported fatalities from pills that users believed were MDMA but were in fact PMA. The bitter irony was that users had no way to know. Pills were stamped with logos, Mitsubishi, Superman, Rolex, the Playboy Bunny, smiley faces, branding that was supposed to indicate a particular manufacturer or batch, but the logos were meaningless. The same Mitsubishi-stamped pill could contain pure MDMA in one city, PMA in another, methamphetamine in a third, or nothing at all. There was no consistency, no traceability, no accountability. Users were playing Russian roulette every time they swallowed a pill. Harm reduction organizations recognized the problem and tried to address it. DanceSafe, founded in the United States in 1998, began offering on-site pill testing at raves and music festivals. They used reagent
Test kits, simple chemical tests that could identify the presence of MDMA, methamphetamine, PMA, and other common adulterants within minutes. The service was free, anonymous, non-judgmental. The goal was not to encourage drug use, but to prevent deaths by giving users information about what they were actually taking. In the UK, an organization called The Loop provided similar services. In the Netherlands and Switzerland, pill testing was not only tolerated but actively supported by governments that recognized harm reduction as a public health strategy. Testing sites analyzed pills, published warnings about dangerous batches circulating in specific regions, and provided education about safe use. The results were undeniable. In countries where pill testing was allowed, fewer people died from adulterated ecstasy. Users who discovered their pills contained PMA or other dangerous substances often chose not to take them. Warnings about bad batches spread quickly through communities, preventing additional deaths. But in the United States, the UK, and Australia, governments actively opposed pill testing. The argument was always the same: providing testing services sends the wrong message. It suggests that drug use is acceptable. It enables illegal behavior. Venues that allowed DanceSafe or similar organizations to operate faced legal threats under laws like the Rave Act in the United States, which held venue owners criminally liable for drug use on their property. Offering harm reduction services could be interpreted as facilitating drug use, exposing organizers to prosecution and massive fines. And so pill testing was blocked, shut down, banned. The result was predictable. More people died. More people took pills containing PMA or methamphetamine or fentanyl or unknown research chemicals synthesized in clandestine labs. More families received phone calls in the middle of the night telling them their child was dead. This was prohibition's core failure laid bare. By criminalizing MDMA, governments had not eliminated its use. They had ensured that users obtained it from an unregulated black market where safety was impossible, where quality control did not exist, where the only certainty was uncertainty. And when harm reduction organizations tried to fill that gap, tried to provide the basic safety information that could save lives, they were treated as accomplices to crime rather than allies of public health. The people who died from PMA did not die because MDMA is inherently deadly. They died because prohibition created the conditions for adulteration, for deception, for a market where profit trumped safety, and users had no recourse, no protection, no way to know what they were taking. By the 2000s, ecstasy had become global.
and the cartels had taken over. What had begun in Texas nightclubs as a small-scale entrepreneurial venture had evolved into a multi-billion-dollar international industry controlled by organized crime. The epicenter of this transformation was the Netherlands, a country with a long history of tolerance toward drug use, sophisticated chemical infrastructure, and a geographic position that made it ideal for distribution across Europe and beyond. By the mid-1990s, the Netherlands had become the MDMA production capital of the world. Belgian and Dutch criminal organizations, many with roots in traditional organized crime families, recognized the profit potential of MDMA and moved into manufacturing. These were not amateur chemists cooking pills in basements. These were sophisticated operations, super labs housed in warehouses and industrial facilities, staffed by trained chemists, producing millions of pills per month. In 2000, Dutch police raided a laboratory in the countryside that was capable of producing 200 kilograms of MDMA per week. 200 kilograms. That is roughly 800,000 to 1 million individual pills, depending on dosage, every 7 days. The scale was staggering, industrial, a level of production that rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing. The key to this industrial-scale production was access to precursor chemicals. MDMA synthesis requires safrole, a naturally occurring compound found in safrole oil, or PMK, piperenyl methylketone, a synthetic alternative. Both are controlled substances in most countries, but they are also used in legitimate industries, which creates opportunities for diversion. Asian chemical companies in China and India, operating within legal gray areas, supplied European manufacturers with tons of precursors. The chemicals were shipped as industrial products, often mislabeled, and diverted into MDMA production once they reached Europe. The trafficking routes were well established. From the Netherlands, MDMA flowed into the United Kingdom, the largest consumer market in Europe. Spain and Portugal served as gateways to South America. Eastern Europe became a distribution hub as the former Soviet bloc opened to Western markets. North America received
shipments through commercial shipping, postal services, and courier networks. By the 2000s, Israel had emerged as a major production center. Immigrant chemists, some with backgrounds in legitimate pharmaceutical industries, set up laboratories producing high-purity MDMA for export. Israeli organized crime groups controlled distribution networks stretching into Europe and North America. The Israeli mob's involvement brought violence, turf wars, assassinations, bombings, as different factions competed for market control. Australia developed its own unique MDMA market, dominated not by traditional organized crime, but by outlaw motorcycle gangs. The Hells Angels, Comancheros, and other biker clubs controlled production and distribution across the country, importing precursors from Asia and manufacturing pills domestically. The Australian market was particularly lucrative. MDMA sold for significantly higher prices than in Europe, sometimes $40 to $50 per pill, compared to $10 to $20 in the Netherlands or UK. Global law enforcement agencies poured resources into interdiction. Seizures increased year after year. By 2010, authorities were seizing over 5 tons of MDMA annually worldwide, millions of pills confiscated at borders and raids through controlled deliveries. The numbers were presented as victories, evidence that enforcement was working, that the drug war was effective. But the seizures had no meaningful impact on supply. For every lab raided, another opened. For every shipment intercepted, 10 more got through. The economics were too favorable, the profit margins too enormous for organized crime to walk away. The production cost for a single MDMA pill was approximately $1 to $2. The street price varied by country, $10 in the Netherlands, $20 in the UK, $30 to $40 in Australia or the United States. This prohibition premium, the markup created entirely by criminalization, meant that a kilogram of MDMA that cost a few $100s to produce could be sold for $20,000 to $40,000 on the street. The global black market for MDMA was estimated to generate $3 to $5 billion annually. That money did not go to farmers or small-scale entrepreneurs. It went to organized crime, to the Dutch and Belgian syndicates running super labs, to Israeli mobsters shipping pills by the tens of thousands, to Australian biker gangs defending their territories with violence. Every pill purchased by a raver in London or a college student in New York funneled money into criminal enterprises that used those profits to expand, to corrupt officials, to buy weapons, to wage wars. Violence followed the money. The Netherlands, long considered one of the safest countries in Europe, experienced a wave of drug-related assassinations and bombings. Israeli mob conflicts left bodies in the streets of Tel Aviv. Australian biker gangs clashed in public, shooting each other outside gyms and cafes. This was prohibition's most predictable consequence. By criminalizing MDMA, governments had handed a multi-billion-dollar industry to the most ruthless, violent actors in society. Users who wanted to feel connected, to experience empathy, to dance with friends, were unknowingly funding organized crime every time they bought a pill.
Law enforcement called it a war, but the only winners were the criminals. But even as the drug war raged, scientists never stopped fighting to bring MDMA back to medicine. In 1986, the same year that Judge Francis Young issued his recommendation that MDMA should be classified as Schedule III, a young graduate student named Rick Doblin made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He founded an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, with a singular, audacious goal: to make MDMA a legal, FDA-approved prescription medicine. It was an almost absurd ambition. MDMA had just been criminalized. The DEA had rejected the judge's ruling. The drug was now classified alongside heroin and LSD, declared to have no medical value whatsoever. Conducting research on Schedule I substances required navigating bureaucratic obstacles designed to be nearly insurmountable. Researchers needed special DEA licenses, extensive security protocols, institutional review board approvals, and funding from agencies that were often ideologically opposed to psychedelic research. But Doblin was relentless. For 35 years, he dedicated his life to this fight. MAPS operated on shoestring budgets, funded by donations and small grants, working within a legal and regulatory system that seemed designed to prevent exactly what they were trying to accomplish. The first victory came in the 1990s. After years of applications, revisions, and bureaucratic delays, MAPS received FDA approval to conduct Phase 1 safety trials, small studies designed to establish that MDMA could be administered to humans without causing immediate harm. The trials were cautious, conservative, conducted
with healthy volunteers under close medical supervision. The results confirmed what the therapists had known for years. MDMA was relatively safe when used in controlled settings with appropriate doses. Phase 2 efficacy trials began in the 2000s. These were larger studies designed to test whether MDMA-assisted psychotherapy actually worked for specific conditions. MAPS focused on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that affects millions, particularly combat veterans, sexual assault survivors, first responders, and victims of childhood abuse. Traditional treatments for PTSD had limited success. Talk therapy helped some, but left many still imprisoned by their trauma. Medications like SSRIs provided modest benefits, but rarely led to remission. Many PTSD sufferers lived for decades with symptoms that destroyed their relationships, their careers, their ability to function. The therapy protocol MAPS developed was rigorous. Participants underwent extensive screening to ensure they were appropriate candidates. They attended preparation sessions with a pair of therapists, typically one male, one female, who explained what to expect, built trust, and established therapeutic rapport. Then came the MDMA sessions themselves, 3 sessions spaced weeks apart, each lasting approximately 8 hours. The dose was 120 milligrams of pure pharmaceutical-grade MDMA, followed by a supplemental dose of 60 milligrams 2 hours later. Participants reclined on a comfortable couch in a calm, decorated room. Music played, carefully curated playlists designed to support emotional processing. The therapist sat nearby, not directing the experience, but providing a safe, supportive presence. What happened in those sessions was consistently described as transformative. Participants reported being able to access traumatic memories without the overwhelming fear and dissociation that normally made those memories unbearable. The MDMA created a window, a state of mind where the trauma could be examined, processed, integrated, without triggering the fight or flight response that had kept it locked away. One veteran described it as the first time I could talk about what happened without reliving it. A sexual assault survivor said, "I could finally see it as something that happened to me, not something that defined me." After each MDMA session, participants attended integration sessions, where they worked with the therapists to make sense of what they had experienced, to incorporate the insights into their daily lives, to build on the progress made during the MDMA-assisted sessions. The results, when published in the 2010s, were remarkable. Phase 2 trials showed that 67% of participants no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD after completing the 3-session protocol. In the placebo control group, only 23% achieved remission. The effect size was larger than anything seen with existing PTSD treatments. The findings were published in prestigious peer-reviewed journals, The Lancet Psychiatry in 2018, Nature Medicine in 2021. The scientific community, even though skeptical of psychedelic therapy, could not ignore the data.
In 2017, the FDA granted MDMA Breakthrough Therapy designation, a status reserved for treatments that show substantial improvement over existing therapies for serious conditions. The designation meant expedited review, more frequent meetings with FDA officials, and a clear path toward approval. It was a stunning reversal. The same government agency that had once supported prohibition now acknowledged that MDMA had legitimate medical value. Phase 3 trials began in 2018. These were multi-site studies conducted across dozens of locations in the United States, Canada, and Israel, involving hundreds of participants. The goal was to replicate the Phase 2 results on a larger scale, to demonstrate that MDMA-assisted therapy worked not just in carefully controlled pilot studies, but in real-world clinical settings with diverse populations and therapists. The results, reported between 2021 and 2023, confirmed the earlier findings. MDMA-assisted therapy produced significant, sustained improvements in PTSD symptoms. The treatment was safe, no serious adverse events, no evidence of addiction or long-term harm. Participants described life-changing experiences, breakthroughs that years of conventional therapy had not achieved. In 2023, MAPS submitted its new drug application to the FDA, the final step before approval. The expectation was that MDMA would be approved as a prescription medicine for PTSD, available through certified therapists covered by insurance. After 37 years of advocacy, research, and bureaucratic struggle, medical MDMA seemed poised to become reality. And then the FDA asked for more data, additional studies, more time. The approval, which had seemed imminent, was delayed. No rejection, but no approval either. Just more waiting, more uncertainty, more bureaucratic caution. The delay was
frustrating, but it was not defeat. The science was solid. The evidence was overwhelming. The momentum was undeniable. Whether approval came in 2024, 2025, or later, it was coming. The question was no longer if MDMA would return to medicine, but when and under what conditions. Plans were already being made. Therapist training programs to certify practitioners in MDMA-assisted therapy, discussions with insurance companies about coverage, advocacy for rescheduling MDMA from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which would acknowledge its medical use and make research easier, expansion to other conditions, social anxiety, end-of-life distress, alcohol use disorder. The therapeutic renaissance that had been crushed in 1985 was being reborn, not in the underground, not in secret, but in FDA-approved clinical trials, peer-reviewed journals, and the slow, grinding machinery of regulatory approval. It was justice delayed, vindication decades overdue, a recognition that the therapists who had testified in 1986 had been right all along. But even as medical MDMA inches toward approval, recreational ecstasy has evolved into something new. In the 2010s, a new term entered the lexicon, Molly, short for molecule, supposedly referring to pure MDMA in crystal or powder form, marketed as more authentic than pressed pills. The pitch was simple and appealing. Molly is the real thing, uncut, not contaminated with the fillers and adulterants found in ecstasy pills, just pure MDMA, honest, safe. It was, like so much drug marketing, a lie. Testing conducted by harm reduction organizations and law enforcement agencies revealed that Molly often contained little or no MDMA at all. The most common substitutes were synthetic cathinones, bath salts, particularly methylone and utylone, research chemicals that produced vaguely similar effects but with higher risks and more unpredictable outcomes. Users who thought they were taking MDMA were instead ingesting substances that had never been properly studied, whose long-term effects were unknown, whose safety profiles were non-existent. The irony was brutal. Molly had been marketed as a return to purity, a rejection of adulterated pills. Instead, it became yet another vector for prohibition's inevitable consequence, an unregulated market where users had no way to verify what they were consuming. Meanwhile, MDMA culture found its home in EDM, electronic dance music festivals. Massive events like Tomorrowland in Belgium, Ultra Music Festival in Miami, and Electric Daisy Carnival in Las Vegas. These were not underground raves. These were corporate-sponsored, professionally produced spectacles attracting hundreds of thousands of attendees, with elaborate stage designs, world-famous DJs, and ticket prices approaching those of major sporting events. And MDMA was everywhere. The deaths continued. In August 2013, Electric Zoo in New York was shut down early after 2 attendees died, one from hyperthermia, one from water intoxication, both having taken what they believed was MDMA.
Hard Summer Festival in California saw multiple deaths over the years, prompting investigations, lawsuits, and calls for the event to be permanently banned. The pattern was depressingly familiar: young people dying from preventable causes, families devastated, and a public debate that rarely addressed the root issue. Some festival organizers embraced harm reduction. They allowed organizations like DanceSafe, The Loop, and Bunk Police to set up pill testing booths where attendees could anonymously test their substances. They installed medical tents staffed by trained professionals. They created chill spaces where overheated or overwhelmed attendees could rest in air-conditioned environments. They provided free water stations and educated attendees about the risks of both dehydration and overhydration. These festivals saw fewer deaths, fewer medical emergencies, safer environments. The data was clear. But other festivals banned harm reduction services entirely, fearing legal liability under federal laws like the Crack House Statute, legislation that held venue owners criminally responsible for knowingly allowing drug use on their property. Providing pill testing could be interpreted as facilitating drug use, exposing organizers to prosecution and massive civil lawsuits, and so harm reduction was rejected, and people continued to die. And beneath all of this, the legal paradox grew more absurd with each passing year. MDMA-assisted therapy was moving through FDA approval, published in the world's top medical journals, recognized as a breakthrough treatment. Clinical trial participants legally received 120 milligrams of pharmaceutical-grade MDMA in therapeutic settings. Their treatment was celebrated, funded by grants, covered in positive media stories about healing and hope. At the same time, a person caught with a single MDMA pill faced federal felony charges. Possession with intent to distribute carried mandatory minimum sentences of
5 years in prison. Trafficking convictions could result in decades behind bars. The same molecule, the same substance, treated as medicine in one context and as a crime justifying cages in another. The class and race implications were impossible to ignore. Clinical trial participants were predominantly white, middle-class, insured. They received compassionate care, therapeutic support, legal access to a controlled substance. Meanwhile, recreational users, disproportionately black and brown, disproportionately poor, faced arrest, prosecution, incarceration. The system's incoherence was total, and the economic divide would only grow. When MDMA received FDA approval, the projected cost for a full treatment course, 3 MDMA sessions plus preparation and integration therapy, was estimated at $10,000 to $15,000. Even with insurance coverage, which was uncertain, it would be inaccessible to most Americans. The wealthy would have legal, supervised pharmaceutical-grade MDMA therapy. The poor would still buy adulterated pills on the street for $10 or $20 and risk prison if caught. Same molecule, radically different legal treatment, radically different moral judgment, radically different consequences. The system was broken in a way that went beyond policy failure. It was cognitive dissonance on a societal scale, a refusal to acknowledge the obvious contradictions, a commitment to punishing some while healing others for using the exact same substance. The drug war demanded that MDMA be dangerous, criminal, worthy of prohibition. But science, evidence, and human suffering all told a different story. By 2024, MDMA existed in multiple realities simultaneously: medicine and menace, healing tool and illegal drug, FDA-approved therapy, and Schedule I felony. The contradictions were no longer sustainable. Something had to give. So here we are, in 2024, still asking the same question we started with. What is ecstasy, really? Strip away the decades of propaganda, strip away the pharmaceutical marketing and the moral panic that just say no campaigns in the FDA approval process, the rave culture mythology and the therapeutic testimonials. Remove the century of contradictory narratives. What remains? A molecule, 3,4-methylene dioxymethylamphetamine, a simple rearrangement of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms. It does not carry meaning or intention. It simply interacts with human neurology in predictable ways. When ingested, MDMA crosses into the brain and floods the synaptic spaces with serotonin, triggering a cascade of effects: euphoria, profound empathy, emotional openness, increased energy. For a few hours, users feel deeply connected to others, able to speak about painful truths without fear, wrapped in a sense of well-being that feels to many like love itself. It is not harmless. Let us be absolutely clear.
The risks are real. Hyperthermia in hot environments, hyponatremia from drinking too much water, cardiovascular strain particularly for those with underlying heart conditions, potential neurotoxicity with chronic heavy use at high doses. These are not propaganda. These are documented, measurable harms. But MDMA is also not the demon it has been made out to be. Statistical context matters. Approximately 1 MDMA user in 10,000 dies from acute complications. For comparison, alcohol kills 1 in 6,000 regular drinkers annually. Horseback riding, skiing, even driving to the festival all carry higher fatality rates. Most people who use MDMA never experience serious harm. Many describe it as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And for some, particularly in therapeutic contexts with trained supervision, it provides healing that decades of conventional treatment could not. The real question was never about the molecule. It was always about control, about who decides what uses are legitimate and what uses are criminal, about who profits from production and who gets punished for possession, about whether we treat drug use as a public health issue requiring education and harm reduction, or as a moral failing requiring punishment in cages. Right now in 2024, people are still in prison for MDMA offenses, serving years, sometimes decades, for manufacturing, distributing, or simply possessing a substance that the FDA is preparing to approve as medicine. The injustice is not historical. It is happening now, as you listen to this. Harm reduction services remain illegal or severely restricted at most music festivals and venues across the United States. Pill testing, which could prevent deaths by identifying dangerous adulterants, is blocked because it sends the wrong message. And so people continue to die from preventable causes while policymakers congratulate themselves on being tough on drugs. The class and race implications are stark and undeniable. Wealthy, predominantly white patients will soon have legal access to pharmaceutical-grade MDMA therapy, administered by
Licensed professionals, covered by insurance, celebrated as a breakthrough. Poor people, disproportionately black and brown, will still buy adulterated pills on the black market and face arrest, prosecution, and incarceration if caught. Same molecule, radically different treatment. Can we learn from this history? Can we acknowledge the failures of prohibition, the lives destroyed not by MDMA, but by the policies meant to control it? Can we build systems that prioritize health over punishment, evidence over ideology, harm reduction over incarceration? Or will we repeat these patterns forever? Commercialize a substance, profit from it, panic when it spreads beyond our control, prohibit it, criminalize users, enrich organized crime, ignore the evidence, and start again with the next drug. These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers. They demand choices. The molecule remains unchanged, indifferent to human drama. It does not care whether we call it medicine or poison, therapy or crime, love drug or killer. It simply exists, a specific arrangement of atoms that, when introduced into the human brain, produces specific effects. We wrote the story. We assigned the meanings. We decided it was sacred in therapy rooms and sinful on dance floors. We declared it could heal trauma in clinical trials, but justified imprisonment for the same use outside those walls. MDMA is none of the things we have called it, and it is all of them: medicine and menace, healing and harm. The molecule does not change, only our relationship to it, our laws around it, our willingness to confront the contradictions. We carry the weight of this history, the lives lost, the potential wasted, the justice delayed. The ending is not yet written. It depends on the choices we make now.